Out of this house, you are not welcome here anymore." Those were the words my father said to me the night before my 16th birthday. Not happy birthday. Not I love you. Not even a simple goodbye. Just get out. I had a backpack over one shoulder. My math homework was inside. So was a granola bar I'd been saving since lunch. That was everything I had when he opened the front door and nodded toward the dark like he was showing me where to put the trash. 6 hours later, his phone rang, and the voice on the other end said something that made him sit down on the kitchen floor and not get up for a long time. But by then, I was already somewhere else, and I was never coming back. My name is Avery. I'm 31 years old now. I live in a small house in Asheville, North Carolina, with a rescue dog named Biscuit and a husband who has never once raised his voice at me. My kitchen smells like coffee and rosemary. There are books stacked on every flat surface because I never learned to stop buying them. Life is quiet. Life is good. But there's a folder on my kitchen counter right now, a manila envelope with a law firm's return address in the corner, and inside that envelope is a document that tells me my half-brother is contesting my mother's will. Again. Some stories don't end, they just take long breaks. To understand what happened the night my father threw me out, you have to understand what our house felt like in the 2 years before that. You have to understand what it felt like to live somewhere that used to be a home and slowly became something else entirely. My mother, June, died when I was 13. Ovarian cancer. She was 41 years old. She had red hair and she laughed too loud at her own jokes and she made the best chicken pot pie in the state of North Carolina. And then she was just gone. 6 months from diagnosis to the last breath. 6 months. My father didn't know what to do with grief. Some people cry. Some people get angry. Some people throw themselves into work or religion or running marathons. My father got very, very quiet. He sat in his armchair every evening and watched television without watching it. He went to work and came home and ate dinner without tasting it. He looked through me more than at me for the better part of a year. So my half-brother stepped in. I should explain, my father had been married once before my mother. A short marriage, early 20s, a woman named Sandra who moved to Phoenix before the divorce was even finalized. They had one child together, a son. My half-brother, who I'll call by his name, Marcus. Marcus was 8 years older than me, which made him 21 when my mother died. He'd grown up mostly with his mother in Phoenix, spending summers and some holidays with us. But he and my father had never been particularly close. Until my mother died. Marcus moved back to our hometown, Greensboro, North Carolina, within 3 months of the funeral. He said he wanted to help. He said our father needed family around him. He started coming by for dinner, then staying for the weekend, then taking over the guest room on a more or less permanent basis by Christmas. My father was grateful in the way that drowning people are grateful for anything that floats. I want to be fair here. In the beginning, Marcus did help. He fixed the gutters. He drove my father to the doctor when my father had a scare with his blood pressure. He learned my father had a scare with his blood pressure. He learned my father's schedule and worked around it. He was attentive and patient and present in ways that I, at 13, simply could not be. But there was something underneath all of that, something I noticed before I had the vocabulary to name it. Marcus watched me. Not in an obvious way. Nothing you could point to. Just, whenever I entered a room, his eyes would track me in a way that made the back of my neck prickle. Whenever I spoke at the dinner table, there was a pause afterward, a beat of silence that felt like an evaluation. And whenever I tried to tell my father something, about school, about my friends, about anything, Marcus had a way of redirecting the conversation before I finished. Smoothly. Naturally. So smoothly that my father never noticed. But I noticed. It started small. Notes I left for my father that he never seemed to receive. A teacher's conference my father missed because he didn't know about it. My father once mentioned, puzzled, that my school had called to say I'd been absent 3 days in a row when I hadn't missed a single class. I told him that wasn't true. He looked at me with that expression, tired, not unkind, but not quite believing either, and said Marcus had taken the call, had written it down. I tried to tell him once, sat across from him at the kitchen table after dinner, and told him that Marcus was lying to him about small things and I didn't know why, but something wasn't right. My father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Avery, Marcus gave up his life in Phoenix to be here for us. He doesn't have to do that. Can you try a little harder to appreciate it? That was the last time I tried. My mother had left a will. She'd been organized like that, careful in ways that only become obvious after someone is gone. She'd worked as a paralegal for 12 years, and she knew exactly what happened to families when there was no paperwork to hold things together. She left the house to my father, which was expected. She left a small life insurance policy split between us, me and my father, which was also expected. And she left me, specifically me, a piece of property. It was a cabin, not large, not fancy. About 40 minutes outside of Greensboro, up in the Piedmont foothills on 4 acres of land her own parents had owned before they died. She'd inherited it, she'd kept it, and she'd left it to me in a separate document, a transfer on death deed, already filed with the county. The moment she died, that cabin and those 4 acres legally became mine. She'd told me about it once, the summer before she got sick. We were on the porch drinking lemonade and she said, "When you're old enough, that place is yours. I want you to have something that nobody can take away from you." I was 12. I thought she meant when I turned 18. I didn't know she was already planning for the possibility that she wouldn't be there. The property was worth roughly $180,000 at the time. In the years that followed, with land prices in North Carolina climbing steadily, it would be worth considerably more. But at the time, I was 13 years old and I didn't think about it much. It was just the cabin where we used to have Thanksgiving. It was just a piece of my mother I still had. Marcus thought about it, though. I figured that out later. At the time, I just thought he didn't like me. I didn't understand the geometry of it, that there was a reason he wanted me gone, a specific financial, calculated reason, until everything fell apart and someone finally explained it to me. By the time I was 15, the atmosphere in our house had shifted in ways I could feel but couldn't prove. My father had started treating me differently. Not cruelly, not obviously, but there was a distance that hadn't been there before. A guardedness. Like I was a problem he hadn't solved yet. Marcus had a gift for suggestion. He didn't accuse, he implied. He'd say things like, "I'm sure Avery didn't mean it," after something I hadn't done. He'd tell my father he was worried about me, that I seemed off, that teenagers today were under so much pressure and sometimes they made bad choices. He planted seeds. He watered them slowly. He was very, very patient. By the time I was 15, my father was watching me the way people watch someone they're waiting to disappoint them. The actual breaking point came on a Sunday in March. I came home from my best friend's house. Her name was Greta. She lived 3 streets over, to find my father standing in the living room holding a paper bag. His face was closed off in a way that told me something was already decided. Marcus was there too, standing slightly behind my father, hands in his pockets, face arranged into an expression of reluctant concern. My father said he'd found things in my room: a fake ID, a prepaid debit card loaded with cash, printed text messages that showed I'd been talking to someone about buying pills. I said I'd never seen any of those things in my life. My father said Marcus had found them. I looked at Marcus. He shook his head slowly, like the whole situation caused him physical pain, like he'd tried so hard to protect me, and this was where we'd ended up. "I don't know what's been going on with you," my father said, "but you need help that I can't give you." I tried to explain. I stood there in the living room of the house where I'd grown up, the house where my mother had died in the back bedroom, and I tried to explain that none of it was real. The words came out tangled. I could hear how I sounded, defensive, panicked, the way guilty people sound when they're caught. Marcus put a hand on my father's shoulder. He said quietly that maybe I needed some time away, that maybe a program, a therapeutic boarding facility, something structured, would help me get back on track. He said he'd already looked into some options. The conversation happened so fast. I still don't understand how it moved so quickly from "we found these things" to "there are facilities" in under 10 minutes. But Marcus had clearly thought about it before I walked through the door. He'd had the whole script ready. My father said I could stay for the night, but in the morning he wanted me to pack a bag. He'd made some calls. I said no. I said I wasn't going anywhere because I hadn't done anything. My father said, "Then you can't stay here." He didn't slam the door. He didn't yell. He just said it. Calm, final, like a decision he'd been building toward for a long time. Then he walked into the kitchen. Marcus followed him. I stood in the living room alone for a moment, not understanding, and then I picked up my backpack and walked out. It was March in North Carolina. Cold, but not brutal. The kind of cold that gets into your chest if you stay outside too long. I sat on the front steps for a few minutes waiting for someone to come after me. Nobody came. I started walking toward Greta's house. I made it about 1.5 miles before I realized something was wrong with me. Not emotionally wrong, physically. My hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. My vision kept narrowing at the edges. I'd been so wound up in the house that I hadn't noticed how badly I was trembling. Later, the paramedics would tell me it was a stress response. My blood pressure had dropped. I sat down on the curb outside a gas station on Battleground Avenue, and I couldn't get back up. A woman came out of the gas station and found me there. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was 64 years old. She'd spent 38 years as a family law attorney in Guilford County before she retired, and she was stopping for gas on her way home from her granddaughter's school play. She crouched down next to me on that curb and said, "Honey, you look like you're about to pass out. Let's get you inside." She bought me a cup of hot chocolate from the gas station machine, the bad kind, the kind that tastes like hot water and hope. And she sat across from me at a small table near the window, and she said, "Tell me what happened." So I did. I told her everything. The fake ID, the prepaid card, the printed messages, my half-brother, the facilities he'd mentioned, my mother's cabin. When I got to the cabin, something changed in Ruth Calloway's expression. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Who told you about the cabin?" I said my mother had, years ago. She said, "Do you know if the deed transfer was ever recorded with the county register of deeds?" I didn't know. I was 15. I barely knew what a deed was. She said, "Do you have any documentation? Anything at all?" I thought about it. Then I remembered something. The summer after my mother died, I'd been going through a box of her papers, just sitting on the floor of her closet, missing her, touching things that had been hers. And I'd found a folder labeled with my name. Inside was a copy of the deed, a letter from the attorney who'd prepared it, and a handwritten note from my mother. It was still in that closet. As far as I knew, nobody had moved it. Ruth Calloway looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "My sister is a family court judge in this county. I'm going to make a phone call." 6 hours after my father opened that front door and nodded toward the dark, his phone rang. It was a sheriff's deputy calling to say that his minor daughter had been found outside a gas station on Battleground Avenue, that she'd received medical attention, and that a family court petition had been filed regarding her welfare and housing situation. He needed to come to Greensboro Family Court in the morning. I know he sat down when he heard that. Ruth told me later that his voice went very quiet on the phone. Marcus was in the kitchen when he got that call. Ruth told me that too later, when we knew more. She said Marcus left the house within 30 minutes of that phone call. He knew. Whatever he'd been building, whatever he'd been planning, he'd felt it start to shake. Ruth took me to her home that night. She had a guest room with a patchwork quilt and a lamp with a yellow shade. She made me scrambled eggs at 11 o'clock at night, and she sat at the kitchen table with me while I ate, and she asked me questions. Careful, specific questions. The kind that a 38-year veteran of family law asks when she is already 3 steps ahead of the problem. She asked me about the folder in my mother's closet. She asked whether I thought it was still there. She asked what I knew about Marcus's finances, about his job, about whether he'd ever asked my father questions about the property. I told her what I knew, which wasn't much, but she listened to all of it like it was significant, because she understood something I didn't yet. If I was removed from the home, placed in a therapeutic facility, declared unstable, stripped of my legal standing as a competent minor. Then my property rights became complicated. A court might appoint a guardian to manage my assets, someone close to the family, someone already present in the home. Marcus had spent almost 2 years making himself indispensable to my father. He positioned himself as the responsible one, the adult, the person who could be trusted to handle difficult situations. He'd been building a resume for a guardianship he planned to request. The cabin and the 4 acres were worth $180,000 in 2010. By the time I turned 18, depending on how long the legal situation dragged out, they'd be worth substantially more. That was what I was worth to Marcus. That was the math he'd been doing in the background for 2 years while I sat at the dinner table thinking he just didn't like me very much. Ruth's sister, the family court judge, was named Judge Cora Whitfield. She was taller than Ruth and had the kind of face that didn't move much when she was listening, which made it impossible to know what she was thinking until she spoke. She came to Ruth's house that night, still in her coat from wherever she'd been, and she sat in the living room and she listened to what I had to say. She asked me twice if I was certain about the folder in my mother's closet. I was certain. In the morning, Ruth drove me to the courthouse. My father was there, looking like he'd slept approximately 0 hours. Marcus was not there. He'd sent a text to my father that morning, saying he had a work conflict. My father had read me the text with a puzzled expression, like he couldn't quite understand why Marcus wasn't there. A court-appointed social worker named Patrick had been assigned to my case overnight. He'd already been to our house that morning, early, before anyone expected him, and he'd retrieved the folder from my mother's closet with my father's permission. The deed, the attorney's letter, my mother's handwritten note to me. The note said, "Avery, this land is yours. It has always been yours. No matter what happens, no matter who tells you otherwise, this is mine to give, and I give it to you. Keep this paper safe. Find someone trustworthy and show it to them if you ever need help." She'd written it before she died. She'd put it in a folder with my name on it in a box in her closet. She'd known, somehow, that I might need it. I don't know how to explain what it felt like to hear those words read aloud in a courthouse. I was 16 years old. I was exhausted, and my mother had been dead for 3 years. But she'd seen this coming. She'd left me something to hold on to. She'd trusted me to find it. The deed transfer had been recorded. Ruth had confirmed that the night before with a county record search she did from her home office at midnight. The property had been mine, legally, formally, unambiguously mine, since the day my mother died. Marcus had known this. He'd had to have known, because at some point in the previous 2 years, he'd pulled the county records himself. Ruth found that out later when she requested the record's access log. He'd looked it up 11 months after moving into our house, right around the time the small sabotages started. The social worker, Patrick, was methodical. He looked at the fake ID and determined it had been purchased at a print shop 20 minutes away from our house, paid for with a credit card in Marcus's name, traced through the shop's transaction records. The prepaid debit card had been loaded at a pharmacy Marcus frequented. The printed text messages came from a phone number registered to a prepaid account purchased 2 weeks earlier. Ruth had made some calls. Ruth knew people. After 38 years in family court in the same county, Ruth Calloway knew approximately everyone who mattered, and she was not the kind of woman who wasted a relationship. She got Marcus's financial records subpoenaed inside of 2 weeks. What they showed was not pretty. Marcus had significant debt. Gambling, mostly several documented trips to Cherokee and one to Atlantic City. Credit card bills, a personal loan from a lender that charged rates that should have been illegal. He'd been managing it, barely, for years. But in the 6 months before my mother died, something had shifted. He'd found out about the cabin. Ruth's theory, and she was right, as she turned out to be about most things, was that Marcus had never intended to stay in Greensboro permanently. He'd come back to be close to the asset, to figure out how to get it, and when he realized the cabin had already transferred to me, he'd had to change his approach. He couldn't challenge the deed. It was airtight, filed correctly, unambiguous, so he needed to make me unable to hold it. The family court hearing lasted 2 days. My father testified on the first day. He had to explain in specific terms why he'd told his 16-year-old daughter to leave her home without verifying the evidence against her. He had to explain why he had not personally examined the fake ID or the debit card or the printed messages before deciding to contact residential facilities. He had to explain why he had not asked me a single direct question about any of it. His answer, when the judge pressed him, was that he'd trusted Marcus's judgment. Judge Whitfield, not Ruth's sister, a different judge, one assigned to the case properly, looked at my father over the rim of her glasses for a long moment before she responded. She said that parenting a child required more than delegation. Marcus didn't testify. His attorney filed a motion indicating he was unavailable and would submit a written statement. The written statement never came. Marcus had left North Carolina 2 days after my father's phone call and had not provided a forwarding address. Ruth found him eventually, but that came later. The evidence was presented systematically. The print shop receipt, the pharmacy records for the prepaid card, the county records access log showing Marcus had pulled my property records, a credit card statement showing purchases consistent with the planted items, a voicemail Marcus had left my father 2 weeks before everything fell apart, meant to sound like a worried brother, but read alongside the evidence, it sounded like a stage manager running a rehearsal. My father heard all of it. He sat in that courtroom and he listened to what Marcus had been doing in his house for 2 years, and I watched his face move through something I didn't have a name for at the time. Shame, I think. That particular kind of shame that comes from realizing you were the instrument of someone else's cruelty without ever understanding you were being used. The judge granted emergency permanent guardianship to Ruth Calloway. My father did not contest it. After the hearing, in the hallway outside the courtroom, my father walked toward me. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. He reached out, then stopped, then said my name. Ruth stepped beside me. Not in front of me, beside me. That small difference mattered. I said, "I know you didn't mean to hurt me." He nodded. He couldn't say anything. I said, "But you need to figure out why it was easier to believe him than to ask me." Then I walked out with Ruth. I went home with Ruth Calloway, which is a sentence that still sounds strange to me even now, because home had been a specific address on a specific street in Greensboro, and then suddenly it was a house on a quiet road in Summerfield with a porch and a garden and a retired family law attorney who made really good scrambled eggs. She enrolled me in a new school. She came to parent-teacher conferences. She drove me to appointments without being asked, waited in the car reading legal briefs, and did not make me feel like a burden for needing her there. She had a rule about dinner: 6:30, no exceptions, phones face down on the counter. And she had a rule about honesty, which was simply that she expected it and she gave it in return. I stopped being afraid that the floor would move under me. Marcus resurfaced about 8 months after the hearing. He'd been in Georgia, working a construction job under a different name, apparently assuming that a retired family attorney in Greensboro had limited reach. Ruth had considerably more reach than he'd assumed. The Guilford County DA's office charged him with fraud, filing false statements, and attempting to exert undue influence over a minor's property. The fraud charges alone carried serious weight. He took a plea: 18 months of supervised probation, restitution to cover my legal costs, community service, and a permanent record that made him ineligible to serve as a trustee, guardian, or estate manager in the state of North Carolina. He would never be able to do to anyone else what he tried to do to me. My property, the cabin, the 4 acres, was protected by a court order until I turned 18. On my 18th birthday, it became fully mine again. No conditions. I finished high school at Ruth's kitchen table, essentially. Good grades, real friends, a school counselor I actually trusted. I applied to colleges and got into 3. I chose UNC Greensboro partly because it was close, and partly because Ruth said she'd be deeply offended if I moved to another time zone. I went to school for accounting, which is funny given everything. I wanted to understand money. I wanted to understand the specific way it moved between people, the way it could be used to help or to harm, the paper trail it left behind. Ruth had taught me, in the most direct possible way, that documentation was a form of protection. I took that seriously. I graduated, I got a job, I moved into an apartment. Ruth came to help me carry boxes and brought a house plant she'd propagated from one of her own and said, "Don't overwater it. It's not as needy as it looks." She was talking about the plant. I'm pretty sure she was also talking about me. I sold the cabin when I was 26. I want to be honest about that because some people ask. I held on to it for years, for the memory of it, for what it had meant. But eventually it was clear that I wasn't going to live in it, and the land was valuable, and the offer was good, and my mother, I think, would have understood. She left it to me so I'd have something nobody could take away. I used the money to buy the house in Asheville where I live now. So in a way, it's still the same thing she gave me, just different walls. My husband is named Daniel. He teaches middle school history, which is either an act of great courage or evidence of a very specific personality type, and I believe it is both. We met at a housewarming party for a mutual friend. He spent the first hour talking to my dog. I brought Biscuit because the mutual friend said I could, and I thought anyone who prioritizes a dog at a party has good values. We got married 2 years ago in Ruth's backyard. Ruth wore a hat with a very large brim and cried twice and denied both times that she'd been crying. My father came to the wedding. We've arrived at something over the years that I can only describe as cautious warmth. He apologized more times than I needed to hear. He went to therapy, which I credit more than the apologies. He came to understand what he'd allowed to happen, not just what Marcus had done. That distinction matters. He's in his 70s now. He has a small apartment. He calls me on Sundays. We talk about ordinary things, the weather, his neighbor's dog, what I'm reading. Some conversations are easy, some aren't, but we have them. I've made a kind of peace with it. Not the kind where everything is forgiven and forgotten and we go back to before. The kind where you acknowledge what happened, you carry what you've learned from it, and you choose not to let it eat the rest of your life. My mother used to say that bitterness is the only poison you brew yourself. She was right about a lot of things. Which brings me to the envelope on my counter. Marcus, it turns out, is contesting my right to have sold the cabin. His argument, filed through an attorney in Mecklenburg County who apparently didn't do sufficient research, is that the transfer on death deed was improperly executed and that the sale was therefore invalid. This argument is wrong. It was wrong when his attorney filed it. It is wrong now. And Ruth Calloway, who is 78 years old and has not lost a single step, reviewed the filing and said, and I quote, "This is the legal equivalent of a third grader's math homework. We'll have it dismissed by Thursday." She's probably right. She usually is. But I'm sitting here looking at this envelope and I'm thinking about the March night I sat on a curb outside a gas station with my blood pressure dropping and no coat and nowhere to go. I'm thinking about the hot chocolate that tasted like disappointment. I'm thinking about Ruth crouching down next to me like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like she found teenagers in crisis outside gas stations every day and she had a system. And I'm thinking about my mother, who filed a deed transfer with the County Register of Deeds when she was 41 years old and sick and running out of time, and who wrote a note to her 12-year-old daughter and put it in a folder in a closet because somehow she knew that her daughter might need it someday. She was right. She was right about the land, and she was right about the bitterness, and she was right that some things are worth waiting for and some things are worth fighting for, and sometimes the difference between the two is something a good attorney can explain to you over scrambled eggs at 11 o'clock at night. I'm going to call Ruth in the morning. We're going to handle this the same way we handled everything else, with documentation, with patience, and with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're standing on solid ground. My mother gave me that ground. I've been standing on it ever since. I think about that curb a lot. Not with sadness anymore. More like the way you think about a place you used to live, somewhere that shaped you without your permission. A gas station on Battleground Avenue in Greensboro, North Carolina. Bad hot chocolate, fluorescent lights, a woman crouching down next to me, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world to stop for a stranger. What I understand now that I didn't understand at 16 is that Marcus never could have done what he did if he hadn't been patient. He didn't show up and immediately try to take something. He spent almost 2 years making himself look trustworthy, making me look unstable, making my father dependent on his judgment. He understood that the real work was in the slow erosion, the small lies, the redirected conversations, the steady, quiet campaign against my credibility. What he didn't understand, what people like him never seem to account for, is that patience cuts both ways. The same quality that made his plan dangerous was the same quality Ruth brought to dismantling it. She was methodical. She was thorough. She followed every thread, and she had 38 years of practice recognizing exactly the kind of scheme Marcus thought he'd invented. There's something clarifying about being 16 years old and having someone try to steal your future with paperwork. It teaches you, very quickly, that the world runs on documentation. My mother understood that. She was a paralegal. She knew that love doesn't protect anything without the right signatures in the right places. So she filed the deed. She wrote the note. She put the folder in the closet with my name on it, and she trusted me to find it and to find someone trustworthy to show it to. She was right on both counts, though I think she'd have preferred I not need it quite so urgently at quite so young an age. I've thought a lot about what it means to actually raise a child with enough sense to survive something like what happened to me. My mother didn't protect me by shielding me from difficulty. She protected me by making sure I understood what mattered, being honest, paying attention, keeping records, and knowing the difference between someone who genuinely cares for you and someone who is performing care for an audience. She modeled that distinction her whole life. I was watching even when I didn't know I was watching. The intelligence piece came later, and Ruth was the one who gave it to me. Not book intelligence, but the practical kind. How to read a situation. How to trace a problem back to its source instead of just reacting to the surface of it. How to ask the right questions instead of accepting the first answer you're given. She used to say that most people never learn to think past their first emotional response, and that the ones who do have an enormous advantage. I've tried to be one of those people. I don't always succeed, but I try. And then there's the part that nobody really teaches you. The staying power. The refusal to collapse when everything is designed to make you feel like collapsing is the only rational option. I sat on that curb because my body gave out, not because I gave up. There's a difference. My father made a decision based on what was easiest in that moment. Marcus made a decision based on greed. I made a decision, every day for years afterward, to keep going regardless of what either of them had done. That choice, quiet, unglamorous, just kept making it over and over. That's what got me from that curb to the house in Asheville. Nothing dramatic, just persistence, compounded daily. My mother gave me the land, Ruth gave me the tools, but the walking, that part was always mine.